Data mining design. The other day I was doing a Google search on mountain climbing, and I honed in on this one particular website, and then I noticed on the right-hand side of the page there were these advertisements all having to do with purchasing mountain equipment. How did they target me as one of these people who's interested in those products? Well, most likely they used data mining. They found out what keywords I used to get to that web page, and then they dug out information as far as what products I would probably be interested in. Companies use data mining all the time. Another example is if you go online and purchase books, you'll see related books as well. In this nugget, we'll talk about the importance of our data mining design. We'll start off with choosing data sources, and it can be from multiple sources actually. You can even grab your data from analysis services if you'd like, instead of a table. Once you have that data, you are going to have to clean up that data, and that's where we talk about staging the data. For example, you might have a table with lots of information in there, but there might be gaps in the information. You might want to populate that data with something. You also might want to get rid of what we call outliers. If you have a range of values in a table, and then you have a particularly high or low value, that's what we call an outlier. I'll show you how to clean that up, and there's several different options for that. And then we'll get into the mining algorithms that you can use. We'll talk about which scenarios are best for particular algorithms. And then the last thing I'll show you is how to use the Microsoft Excel add-on. You can actually implement data mining through Microsoft Excel, and what that gives you is that now you can save these reports in an Excel spreadsheet or in an image format. Let's get started with choosing our data sources. We're going to first of all start off with an empty Business Intelligence Development Studio, and then we'll create a new project in there. So let's just go ahead and say File, New, Project, and make sure it's Analysis Services, and we'll call this Data Mining Design. And here on the right-hand side, we have data sources. Now, the data source, you're going to have a primary one, but you can also have secondary data sources, which I'll show you in a moment. On the left-hand side here, I have data sources that I have created from connections earlier. If what you're looking for isn't in here, then you can always click on New. The name of my server is Julie1, and the name of my underlying database is AdventureWorks DW2008, so mine is already in there. Note that down here you can also create a data source based on another object, such as an SSAS cube. And I'm going to use a service account instead of like a Windows username and password, and I'll just stick with the default data source name. And there we have it. Okay, so if I move this over here a little bit, it's a little easier to see. From that data source, you can now create numerous data source views. And the data source view is just selecting which tables you're interested in. So I'm going to right-click on here and create the new data source view. There it is. Hit Next. Here are our available objects. Now, this is not just limited to tables. These are actually tables, views, and synonyms. And so what we're doing is we're looking for the table that is our training table. In other words, it's the table that contains all the data, and what we can do is create mining models on that, which gives us information such as which attributes are related to other attributes. And we can also predict things if we're dealing with time series. Okay, so let's go ahead and choose the V target mail. And the other table that we want to select is our prospective buyer, and that's going to be for our testing set. The testing set is just a set of data that we want to apply a mining model to so we can predict things. So in our particular case, the prospective buyer pretty much has most of the columns that target mail does, except it doesn't have the column that says whether or not somebody purchased a bike, because they're just a prospective buyer. But using the mining model, we can say yes or no, do we think that they're going to purchase a bike. If you click on either of those and say Add Related Tables, you can quickly choose the tables that have foreign keys pointing to them, but we're not going to need anything else there. Okay, so now we can hit Next. Oh, and by the way, here's this filter here. If you know what the name of the table is, or part of the name, you can always type that in there and hit this icon, and it will drill down to the matches. But since we didn't have that many tables, it was just easy just to find them. So let's hit Next. And here's the name of our data source. We'll just call this AdventureWorks. Those are the tables in there, and then we'll hit Finish. Now, what if we wanted to add tables from other sources? Well, first of all, we would add the source and then add that source to the view. In other words, I could right-click on here and say New Data Source. And instead of selecting AdventureWorks DW 2008, maybe I just want to select AdventureWorks DW, which is a different database. So I could hit Next on there, once again use the service account, and hit Finish. And you'll see now that I have two different data sources. I can now double-click on this data source view. If I want to add a table to it, I simply right-click on here and say Add Remove Tables. And you'll see that there's this drop-down right here, and you can select what you're interested in. And so you'll notice that there's yet another table here called V Target Mail. You could move that over there, and you can distinguish them because this is fully qualified here. Okay, so that's how you would do that. For right now, we're just going to stick with these two different views from the original data source. Now, in addition to just adding tables as is, you can actually create your own what we call named queries. You can join together many tables, and they can even come from different databases. So to do that, you just right-click on that pane right there and say New Named Query, and just give it a name. For example, I might call mine Shoppers, and then you can just right-click on here and you can use a graphical interface to create the underlying SQL statement. So here we're adding tables. I might want to grab my, it's actually a view. If I go to my V Target Mail right there, and close, we can then select whatever columns we want to. So I might just grab, for example, the first name and the last name, as well as their marital status. And so the benefit of this is that you can just narrow it down, and you can even concatenate columns if you want to. So here I'll put yearly income, maybe gender in there, a couple other things. So yes, we're interested in total children, whether or not they own a house, and we also want to know their age and whether they're a bike buyer. And instead of having two separate columns for first name and last name, you might want to concatenate them. So you can put the plus operator there, maybe separate them by a space. So now you'll see under tables, it shows up as a table, and here are the different columns. You can then base your mining structure on that named query. We're going to do an example of creating a mining structure and then a couple mining models within that structure. We'll explore those mining models, and then we'll look at that same information through Excel. At this point, we want to create a mining structure. A mining structure just defines the columns that our mining is based on. So if we say New Mining Structure, we get the Data Mining Wizard. We can tell it to not show the page again. And we can get this information from a database or a data warehouse or from an existing cube that we created. I'm going to choose the first option. And we'll talk about these different data mining techniques. One of the most common ones is the Microsoft Decision Tree, and it essentially creates a tree for you, and you can see what the most important deciding factor is for whether somebody purchased a bicycle. You can also create a mining structure with no models and then create a model later to add to it. So there's our data source view that we created. Hit Next. And here are our input tables. In other words, what is our training data? Well, it's not prospective buyer. Prospective buyer is going to be the testing data. We can either use shoppers, which we just created with the named query, or we can use V Target Mail. I'm going to choose V Target Mail for my case table, and you'll see that there's this other column here called nested. You can actually have one table nested inside of another in your mining structure. An example of that would be if you have a bunch of customers and maybe each of those customers had one or more purchases. It's a containment relationship. But in our case, we don't have any kind of containment relationship, so we can just leave that blank. I'm going to hit Next. And then here we specify the key, input, and prediction. The first thing that I want to do is determine which column is the column that I'm trying to predict. Well, bike buyer is the one that I'm really interested in. So I'm going to check on prediction right there, and then we can click this button right here that suggests what the input tables are. And what this does is it looks at the metadata for the table and it makes suggestions as to which columns are related to that particular column. Okay, so it looks like age is highly related to it, and that's the only one. We can hit OK, and then we can specify other input columns as well. For example, if I want to see if there's a relationship between commute distance and bike buyer, I can click on that. Let's see also if there's any relationship between that and maybe gender, whether or not they own a home, marital status, maybe the number of cars owned, number of children at home. I mean, if somebody has 8 kids at home, they probably aren't going to be out riding a bike that much. Okay, so yearly income, that might have an influence on whether they purchase a bike as well. So now we need to specify what is the key. In other words, what is the primary key for this table? Well, it's the customer key, and you'll see that it's already checked here for us. So we'll just hit next. Then here we specify whether it's a continuous or discrete column. A continuous is a range of values. For example, if we have a column which represents salaries, that's continuous. If we have a column representing gender, that would be discrete. You can just click on Detect to specify that whether it's a continuous or discrete, and it also guesses what the data type is. Then we can hit Next. Percentage of data for testing. By default, it's 30%, and usually that's a safe value. However, if you have millions of records in your table, you want to make the sampling maybe a little bit smaller, maybe 10%. You can also give a maximum number of cases in the testing data set to put a cap on that. So here I might say, let's minimize it to 2,000 cases. Then we hit Next, and here's our mining structure name. I'll just stick with the default. And the mining model name, let's just call this Decision Tree. Now there's this checkbox here that allows drill through, and what that does is drilling through lets you not only look at the general information for a population, but it also lets you drill through and see the details for those people. So I'm going to check on that, and later we can add other columns so we can see more detailed information. Let's hit Next. Okay, so there's our mining structure. We can now double click on that, and you'll see under Mining Models that there's our decision tree, and here we can add other mining models as well. If you just right click on there and say New Mining Model, let's call this Clustering. So these are the only 2 mining models we're going to do for right now. And here we'll choose Microsoft Clustering. And all clustering does is it groups records together by different attributes. So the items in a cluster are highly related to each other. We'll hit OK on there. Notice that we didn't have to redefine the structure because the structure is already defined once. So you define the structure once and you can have multiple models that are based on that structure. So let's say I wanted to go back to my mining structure and modify this. I could. You'll notice that right now my structure doesn't include any detailed information such as the address, email, or phone number. Those would probably be important if we want to use drill through. So I'm just going to right click on here and we're going to add a column. And here we can add here the email address and do that for the address. Almost done. And let's grab that phone number. And now you'll see that information down there. At this point we can then go to our model viewer, and here's our decision tree. It wants us to build and deploy the project first, so we'll just say yes on there. And then we can see how the attributes relate to each other. Now it asks us to process it. We'll say yes to that. And this should just take a few seconds. It really depends on how many records you're processing and how many attributes you're including in there. So it's processing this dimension right now. Here's the underlying select statement. Almost finished. And now we're done. So we'll click close right there and close again. And now we can look at this. And one of the things we can do, if you hit this icon, it's size to fit. Okay, maybe we want to zoom in a little bit more so we can actually read the information there. You'll see that this right here is the root of the tree, and then we're dividing all of those records into different ages and then into different number of children at home. What we're interested in as far as cases is number 1. In other words, number 1 means yes, they purchased a bike. So when we do that, you'll see that the colors for the rectangles change a little bit, and we're really interested in the rectangles that are darkly colored because those are the ones that have a high concentration of people who purchased a bike. So you'll see here, this one is pretty dark. Number of cars owned equals 0, and right before that is age is less than 35. In other words, if a person was under 35 and owned 0 cars, it's a pretty good chance that they purchased a bicycle. Now if we want to look at our clustering model, we can do that. Yes, we need to process the model. And now it's finished. We hit close. And here are the different clusters. Once again, we want to focus in on, here we have the shading variable. And here we want to choose bike buyer for the shading variable because that's the attribute that we're interested in. Notice that the state here is either missing 0 or 1. 1 means yes, they purchased a bike. So you see how the colors change. When I change back to 0, the colors change again. So once again, we'll select 1. Now we look for the cluster that is the darkest. So right here, if you hover over it, looks like 70% of the people in this cluster purchased a bike. So we can just right click on there and rename it. We'll call this high. And then we'll click on, hover over this one. That looks like 31%. This one over here is 43. This one over here, it looks like this one is the lightest one. We'll right click on here, rename it to low. In other words, only 31% in this cluster purchased a bike. Now these clusters are going to stay the same as far as the records that are in there. So now if we want to look at how different attributes have different concentrations within those clusters, we can do that. For example, number of children at home. You'll notice in the state here we have missing and then 0 through 5. This is the number of children. So for the people that have 0 children, look how this clustering is. You'll see here for the high cluster, 65% have 0 children, and for the low cluster, it looks like 93%. If we look at another attribute, maybe the commute distance, if somebody has a really far commute distance between 5 and 10, then you'll see here that for the low, in other words, the concentration of people that did not purchase bikes, looks like 60% of those have a commute between 5 and 10 miles. If we want to look at the commute distance, that's between 0 and 1 miles, you'll see that for this high concentration here, 49% live pretty close to where they work. Let's check out age. If somebody is between 30 and 41 years old, in our high cluster right here, 83% of them are within that age range. If you look at somebody who's over 64, you'll see that over 64, 0% are actually purchasing a bicycle. Now, a lot of what we just accomplished through our Business Intelligence Development Studio can also be accomplished through the SQL Server 2008 data mining add-ins for Microsoft Office 2007. What this add-in is something that you add to your Excel, Microsoft Excel, and it provides some more menus to deal with data mining. So what's really nice about this is that you might have some spreadsheet data and you want to implement data mining on that. Or maybe you already have a mining model and you want to test data that's in your spreadsheet. You can then take the results and put it in Excel format, and you can even draw out graphs if you want to and put that in Excel. What you're seeing right now is the web page for Microsoft's download site for this tool. So all you need to do is go to this website, click download, and it's a .msi file, and you just double click on it and it will install it automatically into Microsoft Excel. Now you need to first of all make sure that you have Microsoft Excel. Once you download it and install it, you can just open up your Microsoft Excel and you'll see that there's now a menu called Data Mining, and you can click on that. If you want to open up some spreadsheet data, you can go ahead and do that. It automatically comes bundled with spreadsheet data. For example, here's the sample data, and you'll see down below that we have several different tabs here, and you'll end up on this splash page right here. So let's say we wanted to hone in on our table analysis tool sample right here. Here's some data, some table data, and you'll notice that we've got marital status, gender, and so on. A lot of these columns are similar to our table in our SQL Server analysis server. But notice here that under purchased bike, it's showing up as yes or no as opposed to 0 or 1. So what's cool about this tool is one of the things we can do is, first of all, explore our data, and we can see the distribution of the different columns. So if I wanted to, here's the table right here, and that's the spreadsheet that we're dealing with, and we can hit next. If I wanted to take a look at purchased a bike here and hit next, we get a graph of yes or no. So we have 520 no's and about 500 yeses. I'll go ahead and hit cancel here. We could also, exploring our data again, we could take a look at the age spread. So you'll see here that the majority of people in our data is between 33 and 41, and the smallest group is 73 through 81. So let's talk about cleaning our data. All you need to do is say clean data right here, and you can relabel values. So here we'll say relabel, and it steps us through this nice little wizard. There's our spreadsheet, and the column that we're interested in is purchased bike. We hit next, and the original labels are no and yes. Let's change that to be 0 or 1. And then hit next. And we can add this as a new column to the current worksheet. We can copy the sheet data with changes to a new worksheet, or we can change the data in place. I'm just going to change the data in place and then hit finish. When we scroll over here now, you'll see that purchased bike is showing up as 0 or 1. Let's do the same thing with homeowner. Here's relabel. Change that to 0 or 1. And then hit next. Change the data in place. Why would we want to change the values in there? Well, in our original table in the SSAS environment, we want to be able to compare these to the other values. Let's also make an assumption that this spreadsheet here is huge and we just want to do some sampling. We can say sample data and then hit next. Here's the table that we're dealing with. We can do a random sampling, and then we specify a percentage or a row count. I'm going to specify 70%, and it creates a new spreadsheet in there. You can even create a worksheet for the unselected data. So it'll be 70% and 30%, or it'll be 60 and 40. The totals will add up to be 100. So now we have selected data, unselected data. We hit finish, and you'll see now that we have right here selected data. If we scroll all the way down, here we have 702 records, and unselected data, we've got 302 records. You might want to use this if you want to have the same spreadsheet for both the training data and the test data. Let's go back to our data right here. Okay, remember a few minutes ago we already trained our data using SSAS. We were in the Business Intelligence Development Studio. So now we can go ahead and test our data. If you click on this icon that says Query, it'll take you through this wizard and it builds a prediction for you. And the mining model that we created earlier was this decision tree, and then we'll just hit next. So remember, we created that in the SSAS, in the Business Intelligence Development Studio. Now the source data is the data that we're actually going to be testing. So let's just stick with this, which is this data right here in the spreadsheet. Then we'll hit next. You'll see how age maps on with age. So on the left-hand side is the training, right-hand side is the testing. Now, it's not intelligent enough to know which columns map to each other because they don't have the same name. So we need to determine that from the drop-downs right here. So homeowner, number of cars owned goes to cars, and then number of children at home just maps onto children. And now we hit next. So as far as the output, we can go ahead and add output, and we're going to predict the probability that it was a bike purchaser. Remember, 1 is yes. We'll call this bike purchaser, and then hit next, or OK. Okay, we can add more output on there if we want to. For example, for the input columns, we'll put on there age. Add output again. Let's add cars, and so on. Okay. In fact, you can take this and move it down. You can change the ordering of these if you want to. Now we hit next. And the query results, we want this to go to a new worksheet. And it's going to process it. And here you can see the different values here. So if we sort from smallest to largest, here we have age 25 and 1 car. Here's the probability that they are going to be a bike purchaser. So if you want to go from largest to smallest for bike purchaser, you can see here that somebody who's 25 with no car has a 91% chance of being a bike purchaser. So a lot of this functionality is also in the Business Intelligence Development Studio, but what's nice about this add-on is that you can actually save this in Excel spreadsheet format. Let's review what we learned in this nugget. We first of all talked about choosing an appropriate data source. That data source can come from a table, a view, or a synonym, and as long as you have a connection to the database, you can choose whatever data source you want to. The data source can also be an SSAS cube if you'd like. Once you define a data source, then you're going to define the data source view, which is where you choose your tables. Every data source view has a primary data source that it's based on, and then you can add additional data sources to it. So if you need to join tables together that belong to 2 different data sources, you can. Then we discussed staging data. In other words, cleaning up your data, doing whatever you need to do before building your mining models. In our example, we renamed some values from yes and no to 1 and 0. Then we took a look at 2 very popular mining algorithms. The first one was the decision tree, where we start out at a root node, then it divides the different records by the attributes that are closely related to the predictable column. There's also the clustering algorithm, where we group records into different clusters based on their different attributes. Each one of those clusters is going to have a probability for a particular attribute to be a particular value. Then the last thing we looked at was our Excel add-on. Make sure, first of all, that you have Microsoft Excel on your machine, and then you'll go to Microsoft's website, download the add-on, double-click on that MSI file to install it, and then you're ready to hit the ground running. So pretty much most of the things that you can do in your Business Intelligence Development Studio regarding data mining, you can also do through Excel. The big benefit with Excel is that you can take spreadsheet data as your source, and you can also produce output in an Excel spreadsheet format. Well, I hope this has been informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.